In the hushed twilight of ages long past, when shadows danced with flickering firelight, and the rhythm of life beat to the sun's slow ascent and descent, there existed a world profoundly different from our own. Imagine, if you will, a time when the very act of seeking slumber was an intricate dance with custom, superstition, and the often harsh realities of survival. This isn't merely a tale of kings and battles, but an intimate glimpse into the hidden corners of medieval existence, exploring the peculiar ways people sought rest, the strange laws that governed their lives, and the sometimes cruel whims of those in power. It's a journey through the quietest hours of a forgotten era, woven with threads of human resilience, folly, and the enduring search for peace in a turbulent world. If this gentle exploration into the past helps you drift into a tranquil repose, perhaps consider liking and subscribing for more journeys into the calm depths of history. Let's start. The fire in the great hall of Lord Beaumont's castle crackled, spitting sparks into the vast darkness above, a lone defiant star in a sky of carved oak. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, rattling the heavy iron-bound shutters and carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine forests. Inside, despite the storm's fury, a different kind of unease settled over the few remaining souls. Young, a scullery maid no older than 15, shivered, pulling her thin wool shawl around her shoulders. Her shift had ended hours ago, but sleep was a luxury not easily afforded in these times, nor easily found. She remembered her grandmother's tales of days when entire families would huddle together on straw mattresses, often with their livestock for warmth, the rhythmic breathing of animals a strange comfort against the night's chill. That was the peasant's way, a far cry from the velvet-draped beds and feather mattresses of the lord and lady. Yet even their slumber was often fraught with its own set of peculiar rituals and anxieties. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't a solitary pursuit for most. For the vast majority, the idea of a private bedroom was as outlandish as a flying carriage. Peasants, tied to the land and its unforgiving seasons, slept communally, their small, often single-roomed dwellings serving as kitchen, living area, and dormitory. They would bed down on pallets of straw, sometimes covered with a rough woven blanket or a sheepskin, the warmth of shared bodies a defense against the penetrating cold. It was a sensory overload by modern standards. The smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the ever-present livestock, often housed under the same roof. The faint glow of a dying ember, the rustle of straw, the gentle snores of family members, these were the lullabies of the common folk. And it wasn't just families. Sometimes whole communities would share larger sleeping areas, a testament to the lack of space and the pressing need for warmth and security in a world teeming with unknown threats. But even among the nobility, privacy in sleep was a relatively novel concept. Lord Beaumont, a man of immense girth and even greater pride, slept in a chamber usually shared with his lady, and often their children, and sometimes even a trusted chamberlain or lady-in-waiting. His massive four-poster bed, an imposing structure carved with intricate beasts and draped with heavy tapestries, was less a personal sanctuary and more a stage for the nightly ritual of rest. Guards would stand vigil just outside the door, their soft murmurs occasionally filtering into the room, a constant reminder of the ever-present dangers from rivals or rebellious serfs. The very act of undressing was a public affair, assisted by servants, and the concept of sleeping nude was almost unheard of, save for the very who had no other garments. Most slept in a long linen nightshirt, often the only clean garment they owned. Had heard whispers from the older servants, tales of Lord Beaumont's grandfather, a man known for his eccentricities. It was said he refused to sleep alone after a particularly harrowing siege. He would demand that his most trusted knights sleep in his very chamber, their formidable forms stretched out on the floor, their presence a psychological shield against recurring nightmares of battle. This practice, while unusual, wasn't entirely unique. The medieval mind often blurred the lines between waking life and the spirit world, and sleep, that vulnerable state, was believed to be a time when the soul could wander or be preyed upon by malevolent forces. Charms, prayers, and sometimes even the presence of others were thought to ward off these unseen dangers. One particular strange habit that fascinated was the medieval notion of segmented sleep. It wasn't uncommon for people to wake in the middle of the night, stay awake for an hour or two, and then return to bed for a second sleep. This first sleep and second sleep pattern was deeply ingrained in the culture, possibly influenced by the lack of artificial light. The hours between the two sleeps were often productive. People would tend to chores, visit neighbors, read, if they were literate and had a candle, pray, or even engage in quiet conversations or intimacy. It was a time of reflection, a quiet interlude in the otherwise relentless grind of daily life. For who often stirred in the dead of night, plagued by hunger or the cold, this idea resonated deeply. She would sometimes use those waking hours to sneak a crust of bread from the pantry, or simply stare out at the moon, dreaming of a life beyond the castle walls. The castle of Lord Beaumont sat perched atop a craggy hill, overlooking the village of. Life in was governed not just by the cycles of the sun and moon, but by the capricious moods of Lord Beaumont himself. He was a man whose cruelty was as legendary as his wealth. He had inherited his title and lands young, and with it, a boundless sense of entitlement. His eyes, the color of cold steel, could glint with a chilling amusement when he witnessed the suffering of others. His laws were not designed for justice, but for control and the arbitrary exercise of his power. One such law, notorious throughout the Shire, was the curfew of the sleeper's toll. Every household in was required to extinguish all fires and candles by the third bell after sunset. Those found with a light burning, even a tiny ember, would be fined a substantial sum, often more than a peasant earned in a month. The stated reason was fire safety, but everyone knew the real intent was to keep the villagers docile and afraid, forcing them into their beds early, limiting their interactions, and preventing any clandestine gatherings that might breed dissent. Many a poor family had been ruined by this law, caught by the ever-watchful castle guards who patrolled the village after dark, their torches casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the enforced darkness. There was a particular incident that etched itself into memory, a stark reminder of Lord Beaumont's brutality. Old Thomas, a quiet, stoic farmer, had fallen ill with a terrible fever. His wife, desperate to keep him warm and to see if he was still breathing through the long, freezing night, kept a tiny, flickering rushlight burning by his bedside. A guard, sneering and callous, discovered it during his rounds. The next morning, Thomas, too weak to protest, was dragged from his bed and forced to stand in the village square, while was publicly whipped for her transgression. The image of stoic face, streaked with tears but refusing to cry out, remained a haunting specter in his mind. Thomas died a week later, not from the fever, but from the exposure and humiliation. The arbitrariness of power extended even to the most basic human needs, including sleep. Lord Beaumont himself, despite his luxurious chambers, often suffered from insomnia, a torment that only exacerbated his cruel disposition. He would pace his chamber in the dead of night, his heavy footsteps echoing through the silent castle, sometimes waking from her fitful sleep down in the servants' quarters. He sought remedies from every traveling physician and sorcerer, from strange concoctions of herb to the blood of unborn animals, but nothing seemed to grant him lasting peace. It was whispered that his troubled sleep was a punishment for his deeds, a torment from the spirits of those he had wronged. One day, a mysterious figure arrived at the castle gates, a wandering mystic, cloaked in dark, patched robes, his face obscured by a deep hood. He claimed to possess ancient knowledge, a way to conquer any affliction, even the elusive torment of sleeplessness. Lord Beaumont, desperate for relief, invited him into the castle, though with a heavy dose of skepticism. The mystic, whose name was whispered to be, had an unsettling stillness about him. His eyes, when glimpsed, seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. He spoke of dream weavers and soul whisperers from lands far to the east, traditions where sleep was a sacred gateway, not merely a cessation of consciousness. Observed Lord Beaumont for several days, studying his habits, his meals, his movements. He noted the Lord's incessant packing, his frequent demands for strong wine late into the night, and his angry outbursts at the slightest provocation. He then declared that Lord Beaumont's suffering was not merely physical, but spiritual, a consequence of an unbalanced soul. He proposed a radical solution, a complete overhaul of the Lord's nightly routine, a return to practices that, while considered primitive by some, were deeply rooted in the natural rhythms of life. His first decree was startling. Lord Beaumont was to abandon his grand bedchamber for a week. Instead, he was to sleep in a smaller, simpler room on a modest pallet of fresh straw covered by plain wool blankets. No rich tapestries, no velvet, no elaborate carvings, just the bare essentials. Furthermore, he was to sleep with his window open, even in the chill of late autumn, allowing the sounds and smells of the night to enter his chamber. The earth's embrace, had intoned, his voice soft yet commanding, is the truest balm for a restless spirit. The courtiers scoffed, whispering behind their hands, but Lord Beaumont, tired of his torment, reluctantly agreed. The initial nights were a disaster. Lord Beaumont, accustomed to his comforts, found the straw itchy, the cold air unsettling, and the sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, unnerving. He tossed and turned, more agitated than ever, but was patient. He introduced other rituals, a nightly herbal tea, a bitter brew that slowly began to calm the Lord's nerves. He prescribed long, vigorous walks in the castle gardens during the day, forcing Lord Beaumont to exert himself physically. He even suggested that the Lord spend an hour before bed in silent contemplation, a practice completely alien to a man used to constant noise and demands. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began to occur. The fresh air, the physical exertion, the calming herbs, and the forced stillness started to chip away at the edges of Lord Beaumont's chronic insomnia. He began to sleep in longer stretches. His dreams, once plagued by nightmares of battle and betrayal, becoming less vivid, less terrifying. The bags under his eyes began to recede, and the perpetual scowl on his face eased, replaced by a weariness that occasionally softened into something almost peaceful. During this period, along with the other servants, observed these changes with a mix of awe and trepidation. They wondered if this newfound tranquility would temper the Lord's legendary cruelty. The curfew of the sleeper's toll was still in effect, and the fear of its enforcement still hung heavy over. But there was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the gloom. Perhaps, just perhaps, a restful sleep could truly mend a broken spirit. Had often spoken of how a lack of restorative sleep could twist a person's nature, making them irritable, irrational, and prone to anger. He implied that true rest was not just about closing one's eyes, but about achieving a profound peace that resonated through the waking hours. One morning, after a week of these strange rituals, Lord Beaumont emerged from his humble chamber, looking more rested than anyone had seen him in years. His eyes, though still sharp, held a trace of something akin to introspection. He summoned, and to everyone's surprise, he thanked him, offering him a pouch of gold, but with a gentle shake of his head refused the payment. "My lord," he said, his voice as soft as a falling leaf, "true payment is in the peace you find within. But there is one more thing. Your sleep is but a reflection of the sleep of your people. If they cannot rest, neither can you truly find lasting peace." Lord Beaumont, still basking in the glow of his first truly restorative sleep in years, listened, spoke of the villagers' fear, the crushing burden of the curfew of the sleeper's toll, and how it robbed them of their fundamental right to comfort and security in their own homes. He explained that forcing people into darkness and fear did not bring order but resentment, a slow-burning fire that would eventually consume everything. He urged the Lord to consider the well-being of his subjects, not just for their sake, but for his own lasting tranquility. It was a bold plea, one that could have easily cost his head. But the Lord Beaumont who sat before him was not entirely the same man. The prolonged lack of sleep had, ironically, made him more susceptible to new ideas, and the relief he now felt softened his hardened heart if only a fraction. He pondered words, his brow furrowed in thought. The idea of linking his own peace to that of his subjects was a foreign concept, yet it held a strange, undeniable logic. He remembered the restless nights, the constant anxiety that gnawed at him, even in his magnificent bed. Could it be that the fear he instilled in others was a poison that seeped back into his own soul, disturbing his rest? After a long silence, Lord Beaumont made a decision that sent shockwaves through the castle and the village. He declared that the curfew of the sleeper's toll was to be abolished. The villagers were now free to keep their lights burning as long as they wished, within reason. He also announced a reduction in certain taxes, a gesture of goodwill that further stunned his court. The murmurs of discontent among his greedy advisers were swiftly silenced by a glare from the Lord, a reminder that while he might be changing, he was still Lord Beaumont. The news spread through like wildfire. At first there was disbelief, then cautious optimism, and finally a wave of heartfelt relief. That night, for the first time in memory, tiny lights flickered in the windows of the village, soft beacons against the encroaching darkness. Families gathered not in fear, but in quiet celebration. The simple act of keeping a candle lit a profound symbol of their regained freedom. Old, her face etched with years of hardship, lit a small rushlight by her hearth, not out of fear, but as a silent tribute to her late husband, Thomas, and a prayer for a brighter future. Watched from the castle walls, a knot of emotion in her chest. The village below, usually swallowed by an oppressive darkness, now twinkled with life, a constellation of small, hopeful flames. She realized that sleep, that most basic human need, was not just about physical rest. It was about security, about peace of mind, about the freedom to exist without constant fear. And it was clear that a ruler's disposition, even his ability to rest, could profoundly impact the lives and slumber of an entire populace. The mysterious mystic stayed for a few more weeks, gently guiding Lord Beaumont towards a more compassionate reign. He taught him the importance of active listening, of understanding the needs of his people, and of the profound interconnectedness of all living things. He emphasized that true power lay not in wielding a heavy hand, but in fostering an environment where everyone, from the highest lord to the humblest peasant, could find peace, both in their waking hours and in their precious moments of sleep. One crisp morning announced his departure. He had fulfilled his purpose, he said. Lord Beaumont, though still a formidable figure, had indeed softened. He was still a lord, and the world was still medieval with its inherent harshness and injustices, but a seed of change had been planted. He had learned that true leadership was not just about commanding, but about creating conditions for well-being, even for something as simple and profound as a good night's sleep. The fall of the arrogant ruler was not in his death, but in the transformation of his hardened heart, brought about by the subtle magic of peaceful slumber. Now a trusted lady-in-waiting to Lady Beaumont, often reflected on these events. She had witnessed firsthand how the most seemingly mundane aspects of life, like how and when one slept, could be with power, cruelty, and ultimately change. The strange sleep habits of medieval people were not just historical curiosities. They were windows into a different way of life, where boundaries between public and private, waking and sleeping, were far more fluid. They reminded her that even in the darkest of times, the simple human need for rest, for peace, could be a powerful catalyst for altering the course of destiny, proving that even a powerful lord could be humbled and transformed by the quiet, insistent whispers of a peaceful night. The lesson was clear. True rest, both for the individual and for society, could only flourish when justice and compassion laid the foundation. A ruler who deprived his people of their peace in turn robbed himself of his own, and eventually such arrogance was destined to crumble under the weight of its own unkindness. The story of Lord Beaumont became a quiet legend, whispered around village fires, a reminder that the quiet hours of the night held lessons as profound as the clamor of the day, and that even the mightiest could be brought to a more humane understanding by the simple, universal need for a peaceful, undisturbed sleep. The cool morning mist still clung to the battlements as made her way to the castle kitchens, the clatter of pots and pans already echoing through the stone corridors. Though Lord Beaumont had, by all accounts, a significant change, the day-to-day rhythms of castle life remained largely the same. Servants still rose before dawn, their tasks dictated by the endless demands of a great household. Yet a subtle shift was undeniable. The air felt lighter. The tension that had once hummed beneath every conversation had diminished. Even the guards seemed to carry themselves with a fraction less rigidity, their faces less grim. It was as if a great, unseen weight had been lifted from the very stones of the castle. often thought about the strange ways of sleep she had learned about, not just from wisdom, but from the everyday lives of the people around her. She remembered her own family's sleeping arrangements in the tiny village cottage before she came to the castle. How her father, a blacksmith, would sometimes rise in the middle of the night after his first sleep, not to tend to embers, but to mend a tool that had suddenly come to mind, the rhythmic clanging of his hammer a familiar lullaby for the rest of the family. Her mother, on the other hand, would use that interlude for quiet prayer, her hushed whispers a soothing sound against the dark. This segmented sleep, now a mere historical footnote in the castle, was a lived reality for many, a natural adaptation to a world without constant artificial light. It showed how adaptable humans were, shaping their rest patterns to the environment, not the other way around. The concept of a sleeping chamber itself was evolving during the medieval period. For centuries, even kings had often slept in semi-public spaces or in the great hall alongside their retainers. Privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury for the very rich, and even then it was often porous. Lord Beaumont's ornate four-poster bed was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a statement of status, a room within a room, designed to offer a semblance of personal space in an otherwise communal existence. The heavy drapes provided not only warmth but also a visual barrier, a psychological boundary against the prying eyes of servants and family members. It was a fascinating contradiction, a display of wealth that simultaneously craved the very privacy its owner so rarely achieved. Recalled a particularly unsettling custom she had heard about from the oldest laundress, a wizened woman named Old, had spoken of a lord from a neighboring county, a man of profound superstition, who insisted on sleeping with a small, carefully crafted wooden cross filled with graveyard earth under his pillow. He believed it would ward off evil spirits and nightmares. Other nobles claimed would keep bed dogs, small hounds specifically bred to sleep on their beds, not just for warmth, but as a living alarm system against intruders. The fear of being vulnerable in sleep was a pervasive one, not just for the common folk but for those with much to lose. The very act of succumbing to slumber was an act of trust, a relinquishing of control, and in a dangerous world this was not easily done. The castle itself, despite its imposing walls, harbored its own set of nocturnal sounds and rhythms. The creaking of ancient timbers, the scuttling of mice in the wainscoting, the distant cry of a sentinel, the ceaseless sigh of the wind through arrow slits. These were the constant companions of sleep for those within its formidable embrace. Sleeping in the communal servants' quarters, often found herself listening to the various snores and murmurs of her fellow maids, a strange symphony of human rest. It was a stark contrast to the silence that now often accompanied Lord Beaumont's sleep, a silence had meticulously cultivated, stripping away the external distractions to allow for internal peace. The story of Lord Beaumont's transformation spread beyond, carried by traveling merchants and wandering minstrels. It reached the ears of other nobles, some scoffing at his newfound softness, others intrigued by the notion that a calmer mind could lead to more effective rule. One such noble was Baroness Isolde, a fiercely intelligent but equally troubled lady who governed the lands to the west. Isolde was known for her sharp wit and her even sharper tongue, but also for her severe chronic headaches and her almost complete inability to sleep for more than a few hours a night. Her court was as tense and unforgiving as Lord Beaumont's had once been, fueled by her constant irritability and exhaustion. Baroness Isolde, hearing of success, sent an invitation for him to visit her castle, though it was framed less as an appeal for help and more as a challenge to his rumored abilities. Ever the calm and unassuming mystic, accepted, having proved herself invaluable in assisting during his time at Beaumont Castle, was chosen to accompany him, a daunting honor that filled her with both pride and trepidation. This was her first journey beyond the lands she had known, a leap into the wider, often dangerous medieval world. The journey to Baroness Isolde's castle, known as, was long and arduous. They traveled for days on horseback, a silent, steady presence, keenly observing the changing landscapes and the lives of the people in the villages they passed through. She noted the subtle differences in their sleep habits, too. In one small, isolated hamlet, the entire community slept in a single longhouse, the smoke of their central fire curling lazily upwards, a constant presence against the cold. In another, a prosperous market town, some wealthier merchants had small, separate rooms, but even then, shared beds were common, particularly among children or between a master and apprentice. The diversity of medieval sleeping arrangements was truly astonishing, a testament to the varying social structures and economic realities of the time. Upon their arrival they found a castle cloaked in a perpetual gloom, a reflection of its mistress's disposition. Baroness Isolde was a woman of striking features, but her eyes were perpetually shadowed by fatigue, and her movements were sharp, almost brittle. She greeted them with a cool, appraising stare, her skepticism palpable. "So, you are the sleep weaver who tamed the beast of Beaumont," she said, her voice a low, dry rasp. "Let us see if your spells can pierce the walls of my own torment." Undeterred by her challenging tone, began his observations. He quickly noted Baroness Isolde's habits, her late-night meetings, her relentless studying of ledgers by candlelight until the early hours, her diet of rich, heavy foods and strong wines, and her absolute refusal to cease working until she felt she had exhausted every ounce of her waking energy. She slept in a grand, albeit cold, bedchamber piled high with thick furs, but even these comforts seemed to offer no solace. Once again prescribed a radical departure from her routine. Your mind, Baroness, he explained, his voice gentle but firm, is a constantly churning mill. It needs not more stimulation but quietude. He urged her to adopt a strict evening ritual. No work after the dinner hour, a light, simple meal, and a period of absolute silence and stillness before attempting to sleep. He also suggested she walk the castle ramparts for a short while each evening, allowing the cool night air to clear her head. Baroness Isolde resisted fiercely. Quietude, stillness, she scoffed. My lands are vast, my responsibilities endless. My mind must ever be sharp, ever working. Merely smiled, a knowing, patient expression. And how sharp can a blade be, my lady, if it is never rested and sharpened anew? He also introduced her to another aspect of medieval sleep culture often overlooked, the power of storytelling and ritual. For centuries, before the advent of widespread literacy, stories were the primary means of education, entertainment, and even therapy. Proposed that, with her gentle voice and keen observations, read aloud to the Baroness for a short while before bed, not from dry ledgers or treatises, but from old legends and folk tales, narratives designed to soothe and transport the listener to another realm. Was terrified. She was a simple maid, not a seasoned storyteller, but reassured her, explaining that it wasn't about performance, but about the rhythm of the voice, the cadence of the words, allowing the mind to gently disengage from its anxieties. Reluctantly, Baroness Isolde agreed, mostly out of curiosity. On the first night, read a tale of a humble shepherd boy who found peace under the vast, starry sky, his simple life a stark contrast to the complexities of the Baroness's world. His voice, though initially trembling, soon found a soft, steady rhythm. The Baroness, though she kept her eyes closed, seemed to listen, her usually tense posture relaxing almost imperceptibly. It was a strange scene. The powerful Baroness, vulnerable in her bed, being soothed by the quiet voice of a young maid, a testament to the unexpected pathways to peace. The first few nights were challenging, much like with Lord Beaumont. Baroness Isolde found it difficult to quiet her active mind. She would often interrupt, questioning details of the story or suddenly remembering an administrative task, but encouraged to persevere, to maintain the calming flow of her voice, to gently guide the Baroness back to the narrative. Slowly, the tailies began to work their magic. The gentle rhythms, the escape into fantastical worlds, started to loosen the grip of the Baroness's anxieties. Her headaches, which had been a constant companion, began to lessen in intensity. She even started to look forward to nightly readings, a quiet ritual that offered a much-needed respite from the burdens of her station. She started sleeping in longer stretches, and her awakenings were less abrupt, less fraught with panic. The change in Baroness Isolde was less dramatic than Lord Beaumont's, but perhaps more profound in its subtlety. Her sharp edges did not vanish, but they softened. She still made demanding decisions, but she did so with a newfound clarity, unclouded by the haze of chronic exhaustion. The tension in Castle began to dissipate, replaced by an atmosphere that, while still disciplined, was no longer oppressive. Witnessing this transformation felt a deep sense of purpose. She realized that the simplest acts, like reading a story or offering a calming presence, could have monumental effects. During their time at also learned more about the specific medieval laws and customs that sometimes bordered on the bizarre, particularly concerning the lower classes. Baroness Isolde, while improving, still held certain rigid beliefs, heard hushed whispers of the mourning bell tax, a peculiar levy imposed on the farmers. If a farmer was not out in his fields ready to work, by the time the morning bell of the castle chimed, he would be fined. This meant that for many, their second sleep was often cut brutally short, replaced by the anxiety of rising before the bell, regardless of their own body's needs for rest. It was another example of how the powerful dictated the very moments of repose for the vulnerable, and how easily these laws could be manipulated for control or profit. There was also the grim, unspoken custom related to the Lord's right to wake. While not an official law, it was a terrifying demonstration of unchecked power. A lord could, theoretically, enter any peasant's dwelling at any hour of the night, demanding lodging, food, or simply to inspect the household. While rarely exercised in its most extreme form, the very threat of this unspoken right hung over the villagers like a perpetual nightmare, ensuring they could never truly feel secure in their own homes, even in their beds. It stripped them of the psychological safety essential for true rest. As she continued to read to Baroness Isolde each night, found herself subtly weaving in themes of compassion and justice into the stories she chose. She would find tales where wise rulers listened to their people, where kindness brought prosperity, and where arrogance led to downfall. She did this with a delicate touch, never overtly preaching, but allowing the narratives to speak for themselves. The Baroness, perhaps softened by her newfound sleep, seemed to absorb these lessons, her sharp mind making the connections without explicit prompting. One evening, after finished a particularly poignant tale about a king who lost his kingdom due to his indifference to his subjects' suffering, Baroness Isolde stirred. "Tell me," she said, her voice softer than usual, "do you believe a ruler truly falls, even if their crown remains upon their head, if their people curse their name in their sleep?" Surprised by the direct question, hesitated for a moment. "My lady," she replied, "I believe a true fall begins not when the external power is lost, but when the internal peace is shattered, both for the ruler and for those they govern. A kingdom built on fear can never truly rest." The Baroness was silent for a long time after that, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle. The next morning, she surprised her court by announcing a series of reforms. She rescinded the morning bell tax, declaring that a worker rested is a worker made stronger. She also established a formal process for villagers to bring grievances directly to her, promising fair hearings. These were not the sweeping changes that had brought about in Beaumont, but they were significant steps, driven by a quiet introspection fostered by regular, restorative sleep and the subtle influence of compassionate storytelling, and eventually departed, leaving behind a Baroness Isolde who, though still formidable, was a far more just and stable ruler, had grown immensely during her journey, not just in her understanding of the world, but in her own confidence. She had seen how the profound human need for rest, when understood and respected, could be a powerful force for good, even in a world often dominated by cruelty and abuse of power. The moral of the story for her was becoming increasingly clear. True power lay not in enforcing restless nights upon others, but in creating conditions where everyone could find the peace necessary for a productive, humane life, and that even the most hardened hearts could be softened, and the most arrogant rulers brought to a more humble understanding by the gentle, persistent magic of sleep and the stories that accompanied it. The medieval night, with all its strange habits and harsh realities, held lessons that transcended time, reminding everyone that a good night's rest was not merely an end to a day, but a fresh beginning for justice, kindness, and peace. Now back at Beaumont Castle, often found herself sharing her experiences with the younger maids. She spoke of the longhouses where entire villages slept in a single room, sharing warmth and the scent of wood smoke, of the bed dogs that guarded noble slumber, and of the segment. Now back at Beaumont Castle, often found herself sharing her experiences with the younger maids. She spoke of the longhouses where entire villages slept in a single room, sharing warmth and the scent of wood smoke, of the bed dogs that guarded noble slumber, and of the segmented sleep that allowed a brief, quiet interlude in the dead of night. She recounted the bizarre curfew of the sleeper's toll and the equally strange morning bell tax, contrasting them with the newfound freedoms in end. Her voice, no longer timid, filled with the wisdom of her journeys, painting vivid pictures of a world both familiar and utterly alien. The younger maids listened, captivated, their own understanding of sleep expanding beyond the simple act of lying down. One evening, as she helped Lady Beaumont prepare for bed, found herself reflecting on the deeper implications of what she had witnessed. It wasn't just the customs that were peculiar. It was the entire medieval mindset around sleep. Dreams, for instance, were often considered portents, messages from God or spirits, rather than mere subconscious wanderings. Noble families would sometimes employ dream interpreters, to decipher the meaning of particularly vivid or troubling dreams, believing that the fate of their harvests, battles, or even their very lineage could be revealed in the nebulous world of slumber. This added another layer of anxiety to the already precarious act of sleeping, as one might be judged not just on their waking deeds, but on the involuntary narratives of their unconscious mind. She recalled a story had told her about a powerful king who, after a series of disturbing dreams involving a crumbling castle and a barren field, became convinced that his kingdom was doomed. He spent vast sums of money on rituals and sacrifices, neglecting his actual duties, all based on the interpretation of his night visions. His paranoia led him to make irrational decisions, alienating his allies and burdening his people with impossible demands, ultimately bringing about the very downfall his dreams had supposedly predicted. It was a stark reminder of how superstition, unchecked by reason, could twist the fabric of reality and bring even the mightiest to their knees. The very vulnerability of sleep could thus become a weapon, wielded by fear and ignorance. Another fascinating, yet often brutal aspect of medieval life that touched upon sleep was related to prisoners and torture. For those accused of crimes, sleep was a weapon to be. Interrogators understood the profound psychological effects of sleep deprivation, using it to break a person's will, to confuse their minds, and to coerce confessions. Prisoners would be kept awake for days, sometimes even weeks, through constant noise, bright lights, if available, usually torches, cold water, or physical prodding. Had heard gruesome tales from castle guards about cells specifically designed to prevent rest, with jagged stones on the floor or cramped spaces that made lying down impossible. The body, deprived of its fundamental need, would eventually surrender, its mind a muddled mess, its spirit broken. It was a chilling testament to how something as natural and necessary as sleep could be turned into an instrument of profound cruelty and injustice. She remembered a particularly harrowing account from a grizzled old mercenary, a man named, who occasionally passed through Beaumont Castle. He spoke of a lord, known for his paranoia, who suspected one of his own knights of treason. Instead of a swift trial, the lord subjected the knight to the vigil, a brutal form of sleep deprivation where the knight was forced to stand for days, chained, without rest, in a cold, dark dungeon. After nearly a week, the knight, a man of strong will and courage, began to hallucinate, babbling incoherently, and eventually confessed to crimes he had never committed, simply to escape the agonizing torment of sleeplessness. His eventual execution, based on this coerced confession, was a grim reminder of the abuse of power that could turn the sanctity of a person's mind and body into a battlefield. Such stories made Appreciate's teachings even more profoundly. He understood that sleep was not merely a physical state, but a gateway to mental and spiritual well-being. Denying it, or disrupting it was to attack the very essence of a person. He often spoke of the sacred rhythm of life, a natural cycle of activity and rest that, when respected, brought harmony and when violated, brought discord and suffering. This applied not just to individuals but to entire societies. The castle continued its slow transformation. Lord Beaumont, guided by initial wisdom and his own evolving understanding, had not become a saint overnight, but he had undeniably become a more just ruler. His knights were still occasionally restless, but they were no longer tormented by the oppressive weight of his former cruelty. He seemed to govern with a clearer head, his decisions less impulsive, more considered. He even began to show a genuine interest in the welfare of his people, not just as a means to a peaceful night's sleep for himself, but as an inherent responsibility of his station. One autumn afternoon, a delegation arrived from a distant kingdom, seeking an audience with Lord Beaumont. They represented King, a neighboring monarch whose lands had recently been plagued by severe famine and growing unrest. King, a proud and stubborn man, had heard the rumors of Lord Beaumont's transformation, and though skeptical, was desperate. His own nights were filled with anxiety and nightmares of rebellion, and his kingdom, much like his own body, was slowly starving, both for food and for peace. The delegation, led by a solemn envoy named Sir Alaric, explained King's predicament. His kingdom was on the brink of revolt, his people were starving, and his own health was failing due to chronic sleeplessness and stress. He had exhausted all traditional remedies and military solutions. Sir Alaric, having personally witnessed the positive changes in and bravely suggested that King seek counsel from the sleep weaver, who had so profoundly influenced Lord Beaumont. Lord Beaumont, now a man who understood the torment of sleeplessness firsthand, agreed to send to King's court. This time, now more experienced and confident, was explicitly requested to accompany. Her ability to soothe through storytelling and her gentle, observant nature had become invaluable. Their journey to King's kingdom was even longer and more perilous than the one to. They passed through desolate landscapes ravaged by famine, where the faces of the peasants were gaunt and hopeless. The villages were silent, the communal fires burned low, and even the sounds of night were muted by a pervasive sense of despair. Here, sleep was not just a luxury, but a desperate struggle against hunger, cold, and the gnawing fear of the future. Saw mothers huddling their children, their eyes wide with fear even in slumber, their bodies instinctively guarding against the harsh realities of their existence. The sheer injustice of it all weighed heavily on her heart. Upon their arrival at King's Castle, they found a place even more grim than had been. The guards were suspicious and hostile, the courtiers resentful and fearful. King himself was a shadow of a man, his once powerful frame now frail, his eyes haunted and bloodshot. He sat on his throne, slumped and weary, a crown heavy upon his head, yet looking utterly powerless. He barely acknowledged their presence, his mind clearly consumed by his torment. With his customary calm began his work. He observed King's habits, his diet of rich, indigestible foods, his constant reliance on advisors who merely echoed his own fears, his complete isolation from his people, and his relentless pursuit of military solutions that only exacerbated the famine. The king slept in a chamber so heavily guarded, so completely sealed off from the outside world, that it felt more like a tomb than a place of rest. His diagnosis was stark. King's sleeplessness was a direct reflection of the suffering of his kingdom. "My king," stated, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "your kingdom is sick, and its illness manifests in your sleepless nights. You cannot find rest when your people know no peace." He proposed not just a change in the king's personal habits, but a complete overhaul of his governance, starting with genuine engagement with his starving subjects. King reacted with a fury that briefly rekindled a spark of his old self. "How dare you? My sleeplessness is a curse, not a consequence of my rule. My people are ungrateful, rebellious dogs," he roared, his voice cracking with exhaustion, remained unruffled. "A curse, perhaps, my king, but one born of human actions, not divine intervention. The cries of your people echo in your dreams, for they too know no rest." It was a dangerous assertion, one that could have led to immediate execution. But seeing the king's profound misery, stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. She began to speak of the medieval sleep customs she had seen, not in a lecturing tone, but as stories, weaving in the shared human need for rest. She spoke of the comfort of communal sleep among peasants, the strange rituals of nobles seeking protection, and the profound peace that came with security and a sense of justice. She then gently alluded to the laws that had once tormented the people of End, and how their repeal had brought peace to both rulers and ruled. Her stories, delivered with such gentle conviction, seemed to bypass King's defenses. His fury slowly drained away, replaced by a deep, heartbreaking despair. He listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time in years, to a voice that spoke not of power or politics, but of the fundamental human need for peace and rest. Focused on tales of ancient kings who walked among their people in disguise, learning of their struggles and finding wisdom in unexpected places. She spoke of the importance of listening to the whispers of the night, not as omens of doom, but as the collective consciousness of a troubled land. Then laid out his plan. King was to leave his heavily guarded chambers and spend a week in a simple dwelling on the edge of the castle grounds, a place where he could hear the sounds of the village, smell the wood smoke, and feel the cold reality of his people's lives. He was to eat the same meager rations as his starving subjects, and critically, he was to personally oversee the distribution of what little grain remained, ensuring it reached those most in need. Furthermore, he was to hold open court daily, not from his throne, but seated among his people, listening to their pleas without interruption or judgment. The courtiers were appalled. "This is madness, the king's dignity, his safety," they cried. But King, utterly broken by his sleeplessness and the profound despair of his kingdom, agreed. He had nothing left to lose. The first days were brutal. King, accustomed to luxury, found the simple dwelling uncomfortable, the food tasteless, and the proximity to his starving people almost unbearable. Their gaunt faces, their emaciated children, their bitter complaints, they were a constant, painful mirror to his own failures. His sleep predictably remained elusive. He tossed and turned, haunted by the images of suffering, but remained steadfast, gently encouraging him, reminding him that this was the path to true healing. Continued her nightly readings, choosing stories that emphasized empathy, humility, and the interconnectedness of all people. She spoke of kings who learned wisdom from commoners, of the healing power of shared burdens, and of how true strength lay not in isolation, but in community. Slowly, agonizingly, a change began. The simple food, the physical activity of overseeing grain distribution, the sheer emotional weight of facing his people's suffering, it all began to wear down the walls around King's heart. He started to hear their stories, not as complaints, but as desperate pleas. He saw their faces, not as rebellious masses, but as human beings suffering under his reign. And when he retired to his humble dwelling, the sounds of the village, once a source of irritation, became something else entirely. A human rhythm, a shared existence. After a week, something truly remarkable happened. King, physically exhausted and emotionally drained, but no longer consumed by internal torment, fell into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. It was a sleep not of escape, but of acceptance, a peace earned through confronting his reality. He woke feeling not invigorated, but profoundly changed. The haunted look in his eyes had softened, replaced by a weary but determined resolve. He returned to his castle, but he did not return to his throne as the same man. He announced sweeping reforms, a fairer distribution of land, an end to arbitrary taxes, and a promise to always listen to the voices of his people. He began to sleep regularly, and though the famine would take time to heal, the oppressive gloom over his kingdom began to lift. The people, seeing their king's genuine efforts, slowly regained hope, and with hope came a glimmer of peace, and eventually took their leave from King's now hopeful kingdom. Their journey had shown them the profound truth that the sleep of a ruler, and indeed the sleep of a nation, was intricately linked to justice, compassion, and the shared well-being of all its inhabitants. The arrogance of rulers who believed themselves separate from their people, who enforced cruelty and disregarded suffering, inevitably led to their own restless nights and, ultimately, to their metaphorical fall. Their crowns might remain, but their inner peace would shatter, and with it, the stability of their realms. Now a young woman of incredible experience and empathy returned to Beaumont Castle. She understood that while the medieval world was filled with strange sleep habits, from communal bedding to segmented rest, from bed dogs to dream interpreters, the underlying human need for secure, peaceful slumber remained universal, and that need, when or abused, could lead to immense suffering and injustice. The moral of their journey was a powerful one. The peace of the night was a reflection of the justice of the day. A ruler's sleep was only as sound as the sleep of his humblest subject, and those who oppressed their people, even through the denial of basic rest, were ultimately sowing the seeds of their own destruction, ensuring their own nights would be as turbulent as the lives they inflicted upon others. The arrogant ruler's fall, then, was not always a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing descent into a sleepless torment, a self-inflicted wound that ultimately consumed not just them, but often their entire kingdom. And the path to true restorative sleep, whether for a king or a commoner, always began with compassion, justice, and the courage to truly see and acknowledge the suffering of others. The whispers of the medieval night held not just stories of strange customs, but profound lessons for all of humanity, lessons about the interconnectedness of power, peace, and the most basic human need for a quiet, undisturbed rest. It was a truth that resonated through the ages, reminding us that true leadership cultivates peace, ensuring that everyone from the highest to the lowest can find solace in the embrace of a calm, restorative sleep, free from the burdens of fear and injustice. It was a lesson would carry with her for the rest of her days, a quiet wisdom gleaned from the very heart of the medieval night. This understanding of sleep, woven into the fabric of medieval life, had grown to encompass not just the personal, but the societal. She saw how deeply ingrained the customs and laws around rest were, often reflecting the harsh class distinctions and power dynamics of the era. The communal sleeping of peasants, while born of necessity for warmth and security, also reinforced their collective identity, a stark contrast to the emerging desire for individual space among the nobility. Yet even among the privileged, the absence of modern comforts and the ever-present threat of disease, famine, and violence meant that true, undisturbed sleep was often a precious commodity, sought through a myriad of bizarre and sometimes desperate means. She recalled speaking of the sleeping sickness, a debilitating illness that would sometimes sweep through villages, rendering people utterly lethargic, unable to work, and eventually leading to death. Superstition often attributed it to curses or malevolent spirits, but with his more grounded wisdom, hinted at poor sanitation and unfamiliar ailments brought by trade. The fear of such diseases meant that sometimes even sleep itself was viewed with suspicion, as a vulnerable state where one might fall prey to unseen afflictions. This fueled more bizarre rituals. Some would sleep with garlic braids under their pillows, others with small pouches of salt, believing these simple items could ward off illness or bad luck. The role of religion also permeated medieval sleep. Monasteries and convents, with their strict daily routines, structured sleep differently. Monks and nuns would often rise several times during the night for prayers, their vigils a dedicated period of spiritual reflection. Their cells, though private, were often sparse, with hard beds and thin coverings, reflecting an ascetic ideal. Yet, even in this austere environment, the purpose was to find a deeper peace, a spiritual rest that transcended mere physical slumber. The sound of the bells, marking the hours for prayer, became their nocturnal rhythm, a different kind of segmented sleep, driven by devotion rather than environmental factors. Had once encountered a group of traveling mendicant friars who spoke of an old custom in some remote regions where people would sleep on graves for a single night, believing it would cure them of chronic ailments or bring them closer to deceased loved ones. It was a macabre practice, yet born of a profound faith and a desperate hope for healing, a testament to the extremes people would go to find peace in body and mind, even if it meant confronting the ultimate stillness of death. The boundary between the waking world and the slumbering world, and even the world of the living and the dead, seemed far more permeable in the medieval imagination. The practice of waking the dead was another peculiar custom that, while not directly related to the sleep of the living, deeply influenced the atmosphere of medieval nights. When someone died, their body would often be kept in their home or in the church for several nights before burial. Family and friends would gather, not just to mourn, but to ensure the deceased was truly gone, and to guard against malevolent spirits entering the body. These wakes, often accompanied by storytelling, feasting, and sometimes raucous games, turned the solemnity of death into a strangely communal and often loud nocturnal event, further blurring the lines between the stillness of sleep and the finality of death. As continued her duties, helping Lady Beaumont dress for court, she listened to the snippets of conversations among the nobles, often revolving around recent dreams or anxieties. The new Lord Beaumont, though calmer, still faced the political machinations of his peers. The threat of war, the precariousness of alliances, the constant jostle for power, these were the restless companions of noble sleep. Even with wisdom and a more just rule, the medieval world remained a place of inherent danger and uncertainty. One day, news arrived that brought a fresh wave of concern. A powerful neighboring Duke known for his insatiable greed and ruthless ambition, had begun to aggressively expand his territories, threatening smaller, weaker lords. Duke was infamous for his night raids, surprise attacks launched under the cover of darkness, designed to catch his enemies literally in their sleep. His strategy was to deny his opponents any restful slumber, keeping them perpetually on edge, exhausted and vulnerable. He believed that a sleep-deprived foe was an easily defeated foe, a chillingly effective tactic that epitomized the abuse of power. Lord Beaumont, remembering his own torment of sleeplessness, understood the insidious nature of Duke's methods. He knew that physical defenses alone would not be enough. The morale of the people, their ability to find peace even in times of threat, would be crucial. He summoned his advisors, his face serious, who had remained at Beaumont Castle as an occasional counsel, offered his insights. Duke attacks not just bodies, my lord, but minds. He seeks to sow sleeplessness, for a mind deprived of rest is a mind easily conquered. Suggested a multifaceted approach, one that went beyond traditional warfare. Firstly, he advised strengthening the castle's external defenses, but also implementing a strict, yet compassionate, internal regimen for the castle garrison. Guards were to be rotated frequently, ensuring they received adequate rest, rather than being pushed to the brink of exhaustion, a common practice in medieval sieges. A vigilant guard is a rested guard, emphasized. Secondly, and more unusually, proposed a strategy to counter the psychological warfare of Duke's night raids. He suggested that whenever news of a raid, even a distant one, reached, the village bells should be rung, not in alarm, but in a slow, steady, reassuring rhythm. It will be a sound of presence, not panic, explained. A reminder that they are not alone, even in the darkest hours. Thirdly, Lord Beaumont, at's urging, began visiting the watchtowers and outer fortifications more frequently, especially at night. Not to berate the guards, but to speak with them, to offer encouragement, and to personally ensure their well-being. This was a radical departure from the norm, where lords rarely engaged directly with their lowest soldiers. His presence, a symbol of shared vigilance, began to instill a sense of trust and security among his men, allowing them to rest more deeply when off duty. His role became even more significant. She, along with other trusted servants, was tasked with organizing night watches within the village itself, not for defense but for comfort. When a villager was too afraid to sleep, or was struggling with nightmares of approaching forces, a designated night watcher would sit with them, perhaps tell a story, or simply offer a comforting presence. It was a communal effort to combat fear and restore the possibility of restful sleep. These night watchers were equipped with small, shielded lanterns, a silent defiance of the old curfew, now a symbol of collective care. Duke's forces, true to his reputation, launched a series of probing attacks. His raiders would appear at the edges of Lord Beaumont's lands, burning isolated farmsteads, stealing livestock, and sowing terror. The villagers, initially panicked, found solace in the steady tolling of the bells and the quiet, comforting presence of the night watchers. Though fear was still present, it was no longer all-consuming. They found moments of rest, precious hours of sleep, that allowed them to wake with enough strength to face the next day. One particularly harsh winter night, Duke launched a full-scale assault on a strategically important outpost on Beaumont's western border. The battle raged through the night, a brutal clash of steel and fire. The news reached by dawn, carried by a breathless messenger. The villagers, expecting the worst, were filled with dread. But Lord Beaumont, after receiving reports, appeared before them, his face grim but resolute. He spoke of the bravery of his soldiers, of the strength of their defenses. And then he said something that truly astonished everyone. "We fought through the night, and we held our ground. Our men, though weary, were not broken, for they knew their homes were safe, and that their leaders watched over them, even as they slept. Duke relies on fear and exhaustion, but we shall counter him with vigilance and rest." He then announced that for the next 3 days all non-essential work would cease. The castle kitchens would provide hot meals for anyone who needed them, and the entire community was encouraged to spend time together, sharing stories, warmth, and fellowship. "Let us find our rest together," he declared, "for a rested people are a strong people." It was a radical idea in a medieval world driven by constant labor. But Lord Beaumont understood the deeper lesson had taught him. That true strength came not from relentless toil, but from balanced well-being, including the fundamental human need for restorative sleep. The 3 days passed in a haze of communal activity, shared meals, and surprisingly, moments of genuine peace. The villagers, though worried, found comfort in each other's company. The simple act of being allowed to rest, to gather, to not worry about taxes or curfews for a brief time, was a powerful antidote to Duke's psychological warfare. They discovered that collective rest could be a form of quiet defiance, a way to reclaim their humanity in the face of aggression. Meanwhile, Duke's forces, though numerous, were beginning to show cracks. His own soldiers, pushed to the brink of exhaustion by his relentless night raids and his disregard for their well-being, were becoming demoralized. They fought not with zeal, but with resentment. Their sleep, if they got any, was fitful and unsatisfying, plagued by the constant demands of their cruel lord. The siege of the western outpost dragged on, but whilst men grew increasingly weary and Lord Beaumont's forces, though smaller, fought with a renewed vigor, they were rested, fed, and knew that their families in were safe. The contrasting states of sleep, or lack thereof, between the two armies began to tell. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting, Duke, his own energy depleted, his advisors fearful, and his army on the verge of mutiny due to sheer exhaustion, was forced to withdraw. It was a victory for Lord Beaumont, not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of human spirit and well-being. The arrogant Duke, who had sought to conquer by denying others the peace of sleep, was himself defeated by the very exhaustion he inflicted. His fall was not a military rout, but a gradual crumbling of morale and physical capacity, a stark illustration of how the abuse of power, even down to the fundamental human right to rest, eventually consumes the oppressor. Stood with Lord Beaumont on the battlements, watching Duke's retreating forces disappear into the horizon. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the land. Was right, she said quietly. A kingdom and a ruler can only truly stand when its people can sleep in peace. Lord Beaumont nodded, his gaze distant. Indeed, I once thought power was in forcing sleeplessness. Now I know it is in fostering rest. He looked at the bustling village below, already resuming its daily rhythms but with a renewed sense of resilience. The lessons of medieval sleep, with all its strange and varied customs, had taught him that the most profound strength came not from coercion, but from care, not from tyranny, but from tranquility. The path to a stable kingdom and a peaceful reign was paved not just with stone walls, but with the quiet, restorative power of a good night's sleep for all. The fall of arrogant rulers, then, was often a slow, agonizing slide into a sleepless torment, a self-inflicted wound that ultimately consumed them and their ambitions. True power, the story revealed, lay in the ability to allow both oneself and one's people to find undisturbed rest, for only then could wisdom, justice, and lasting peace truly flourish. And that new was a lesson that would echo through the ages, far beyond the medieval night.